Alright, welcome back to another video. So in this video, we're going to go ahead and set up Jest with our application. So that way we can actually write some unit tests for our web API. Up until now, we have not written any automated unit tests. We've only performed manual UAT, which is actually called user acceptance testing, which is where we basically go into the browser or we use like manual testing to ensure that the application is actually working. Now, even though that does work from an end user perspective, it does become problematic and it's not a scalable solution, because if you have a really large application and you have lots of features, you're not going to be able to test every single existing feature whenever you make a new one. And the reason why you would do that is because it will tell you if new features, or if you update an existing feature, if it'll break the tests, which gives you a good indication of whether or not it can become problematic. Like if it's breaking the test, it's very likely that it's breaking the existing feature. So you're going to have to look into that matter. Okay, and it also helps you expose bugs too when you write meaningful unit tests. Okay, so the importance of unit testing allows you to test small individual components of your application. So rather than testing the whole thing, right? Because that's where we do not unit end-to-end testing, is where we test the whole entire application as a whole, right? When it comes to unit testing, we just test small pieces of our application. So we might want to test an individual function and just ensure that that function, given a certain set of parameters, is going to do what is expected to do. Okay, if we were to do an end-to-end test, we would actually need to do everything, such as calling a database, calling any remote APIs, right? When it comes to end-to-end testing, you're actually testing the whole application. When it comes to unit testing, you're testing just a small piece of the application. Okay, and I'll show you several examples in this tutorial. So hopefully that makes sense, and let's go ahead and get started with setting up Jest. Alright, so to get started, the first thing that we'll have to do, of course, is install Jest. So I'm going to go ahead and install Jest as a dev dependency. Okay, now if you are using Babel or TypeScript, you can there are actually tutorials that show you how to set up Jest. You can also just install Jest, okay, which is just the TypeScript version of Jest, which makes things so much easier. All right, but since we're not using TypeScript, or we're not using Babel, we're just going to go ahead and install Jest. Okay, so now that we have installed Jest, if we go over to the node modules folder, if we go to the .bin folder, we should see the Jest binary installed locally. So we can actually just run the Jest command using either npx or yarn. So I can do yarn Jest, and I'm going to do -v, and we're on version 27.4.7, and you can see this is where the binary is from. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and initialize Jest. So I'm going to do yarn Jest -init, and it's going to go ahead and ask us a bunch of questions. So it's going to ask us, would you like to use Jest when running test script? And since we don't have a test script, or we do, but we're just going to hit yes to reconfigure that script for us. It's going to ask us, would you like to use TypeScript? No, we're not using TypeScript. For the environment, we'll select Node. We'll select No for coverage reports. And then for this, we'll just select V8. And then we will select yes for this. Okay, so you're going to see that's going to create this jest.config.js file. Okay, and it basically sets up all of the configurations for us, the default ones at the very least. Okay, so what we're going to need to do is right over here where you see test match, I'm going to actually uncomment this. So this is going to detect test files, okay, in this specific __tests__ folder. Okay, but in general, as long as you have files that end with .test.js or .spec.js, then Jest will pick up those test files. Okay, now of course if you're using TypeScript, it would just be .spec.ts or .test.ts. Okay, so but yeah, Jest would be able to pick up those files. Okay, and there's a bunch of other stuff too, but we're going to ignore all those properties for now. If you want to learn more about it, feel free to just consult the documentation on the justjs.io website, and it will go ahead and give you a good overview of it. Okay, so we have our Jest script over here when you run test Jest. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a folder. I'm going to do this inside the source folder. And I'm going to create a folder called __tests__. Okay, and this is common where you create all of your test files inside this folder. Okay, and let's go ahead and write some tests. So the question here is, what exactly do we want to test? Well, remember, when you're unit testing, you want to test small pieces of your code. And typically that includes just testing a function. Okay, so for example, let's just say I want to ensure that my business logic for this register function is working properly. Okay, likewise, I want to make sure that this groceries function right over here, I want to make sure that all of these functions are working as intended. Okay, so how do I make sure that they work? Well, the first step would to be writing a unit test. Okay, once you have written your unit tests, then you can start writing functional as well as end-to-end tests. Okay, you don't only write unit tests usually, you usually want to write unit tests as well as end-to-end tests. Okay, so let's go ahead and first, I would say that this right over here, this function is a good function that we can test. I think this would give us a good idea of how testing as a whole works. So let's go ahead and test this part of our application over here. So we're going to test this function that's going to be called whenever the user visits the API/v1/auth/register endpoint. Now, the question here is, how do we actually test this function? Well, the first thing that we'll have to do is we're actually going to take this function and we're actually going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to actually create a new folder inside the source folder, and I'm going to actually call this controllers. Okay, and I'm going to create a new file and I'll call this auth.js. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this function, we're going to export this. Let me just first create that up here. We're going to go ahead and give this function a name because before it was actually an anonymous function. Okay, I'm going to call this auth register controller. And let me go ahead and export this as a named export. Okay, so now I'm going to import that up top over here. And so this is just a named function, and the same logic is going to work. It's just that it's now a named function. And the reason why we are doing this is because what we are going to do is we're going to import this function into a file into the test folder. Now, why are we doing this? Well, the reason why we're doing that is because how on earth are we going to export an anonymous function? Okay, there's no way that we could do that. Now, the reason why we can't is because, well, it's an anonymous function. It's passed as a callback function. We didn't give it a name. We're not exporting at all. So there's no way that we can actually import that function anywhere in our code to actually unit test it. Okay, so instead, what we're going to do is we're going to give that function a name. We're going to define it somewhere. So we're going to define it inside auth.js, and we're going to export it. And now we're going to go inside tests.js. I'm going to create a folder called controllers. So this will represent all the tests for controllers. And I'll call this auth.spec.js, or you can call it auth.test.js. It's up to you. Okay, so I'm going to go over here. I'm going to run yarn test real quick just to show you what happens. And you can see that it picks up this auth.test.js file. If ours changes to .spec.js, it would pick it up as well. Okay, so let's go ahead and inside this file, let's import this auth register controller first. So we'll go out two directories, we'll go into controllers, we'll step into auth, just like that. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and write our first test. So to write our first test, let's go ahead and use the it function. Okay, And what I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead and pass in our first argument, which is going to be the name of the test. So I'm going to go ahead and give a name for this test. And usually when you're writing tests, you want to describe what the test does. And the reason why this is important is because it'll help you remember what exactly this test is for. And it also gives other people more insight on what exactly the code base and what exactly the code is supposed to do. One good way that you can identify what a part of the application does is just by reading the tests for the application. So if you write well-defined tests and if you write a good small short description, people can understand your code a lot better, or at least they can guess and predict what exactly is going on. So for this test, well, again, this is where it can be a little bit confusing, right? And this was one of the things that I got confused about when I first tried to learn testing. So I'm going to kind of like guide you through my thought process. So when we wanted to write unit tests, we first have to look at the function that we want to test, okay, also known as the system under test, okay, and we have to ask ourselves, well, what exactly do we want to test? Well, if we were to test this function, like by doing a UAT where we visit the register endpoint by making a post request and passing in data manually, right? Well, we would manually test it by, going into Postman, passing in the email, password, and then checking to see what the response status was returned, right? But we're not doing that right now. We have to look at it from a perspective, from a unit testing perspective, right? Well, what's the first thing that we should focus on first, right? What are the main things that we need to test for this function? What does this function actually do? Well, let's kind of like walk through this. Well, our function does several things. One, it goes ahead and it searches for a user from Mongoose, from MongoDB by calling user.find1. Okay? Then it checks to see if that user was found or not. And if that user was found, it's going to go ahead and return a status code of 400 and send an object back to the user with a message that says user already exists. Okay? So that's one thing. That's one path that our function can take based off of the truthiness of the user, okay? If the user was not found, so if userdb is falsy, then it's going to take a different path in our code. It's going to go ahead and hash the password. It's going to go ahead and create a new user and send back a status code of 201. So in other words, our function does two main things that we have to test for. We have to test to see if this function actually returns a status code of 400 and sends back this object that says user already exists. And then we have to write another test to ensure that it sends back a status code of 201. Okay, so now that we have identified what two main things our function does, it makes it a lot easier for us to realize what we need to actually write tests for. Now let's go back to our code, and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and give this test a name. So we're going to go ahead and first say, well, let's test to see if the response status is going to be 400 and if it's going to send back this object, okay? So we're going to go ahead and say should send a status code of 400. And let's be a little bit more descriptive when user exists, okay? And so the second parameter is going to be a callback function. And this could also be an asynchronous function as well, if you need it to be, okay? So if we were to actually go into our code right now, and if I just do yarn test, you're going to see that it's going to say should send a status code of 400 when user exists. So our test passes, okay? Even though it doesn't do anything, but it still passes, okay? So what do we want to do now? Now we actually have to write the test. So we have to look at our code. Now, this is the tricky part, right? Because our code actually does a bunch of different things. So first, we destructure the email property from the body object, from the request.body object. Then we actually call find1 on the Mongoose user model. Now, actually, I forgot to do one more thing. I actually need to import the user schema or the user model up here. So excuse me for that. All right. And one more thing that I should also fix is we actually don't even have a username. I'm not sure why I had that there. Must have forgot to remove it. But it's just email and password. Okay, as you can see, email and password. Okay, so right now, the first thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to need to mock this find one function call. Okay, so watch this. In order for us to actually get this to work inside our test, we want to invoke the function that we're trying to test. So in other words, we're going to invoke auth register controller. So let's do that. And now let's go ahead and run the test again. And let's see what happens. We should get an error. And you're going to see that it says unhandled promise rejection, cannot read properties of undefined. So the error here is cannot read properties of undefined reading body. Okay, so why is this happening? Well, remember, auth register controller is supposed to take in two arguments, the request and the response object. Okay, and we're trying to reference properties on these objects. So of course it's going to throw an error. So this is where we have another concept that is very important to understand called stubbing. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to stub out data, also known as creating mock data that we can use temporarily for the system that we're testing. So in our case, we're trying to test auth register controller, right? Now, in the actual runtime of the application, when the user makes a request, these two objects are actually going to represent a request and a response instance, right? It's going to represent the user's request for the request object. Well, because we're unit testing, we're not going to actually have an entire fully populated request object, and we don't need to. The only thing that we need to do is just create a stub or like a fake request object that has the properties and any functions that we're going to actually use in this function that's being tested. Okay, so let's take a look real quick. So if we look at the request object, we can see that the request object requires this body property because we're actually referencing request.body. So we're going to need to create a fake request object that has a body property. And that body property is supposed to be an object that's going to have an email as well as a password. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a fake request object, and we can do that by just creating a regular object. So I'm going to call this request, and we're going to create a body property and map that to an object. We're going to have username, fake username, password, fake password, and this should actually be email, not username. But you get the point, right? You're basically supposed to pass in the data that you would actually need in the actual runtime of the application. But instead, we're just mocking it, okay? Or creating a stub. So let's see. Okay, so now that we've created this request, let's go ahead and pass that in. Okay, now before we do anything else, let's go ahead and just call, or not call, let's just run the tests. And we should see that that error is not going to be there anymore. Okay, now it is passing, but it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean that the test is actually working because we actually didn't really test anything, right? All we did was we just call this function. We haven't written what's called an assertion. Okay, assertions are basically what we can do to assert that our code is actually working the way that it is intended. So for example, if we're just calling this function and not writing any assertions, we're not really testing anything. We want to write assertions that assert that, hey, look, this user.findOne method is being called, and then based off of the return value of that, this response status is going to be called, and then this send function is going to be called. So in order to do that, we now need to do something called mocking. Okay, so let me go and do this. Let me add async in front of over here. Let me do a wait. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and mock out this find one method. Okay, because we need to know what the return value of find one is. So what I'll do now is first let me just make this an asynchronous function so I can use await. And I'm going to go ahead and import the user schema up top over here. All right, because remember, our auth register controller is going to be calling this find one method. Okay, now you're gonna see that if I were to run this test right now, you're gonna see that. Let me just run the yarn test. It's actually going to take a really long time to actually finish. And the reason why is because when we actually call this function, what's happening is it's actually trying to call the database, okay? And in an actual unit test, you don't want to actually call the database, okay? You don't want to make actual remote API calls. You don't want to interact with the database in unit tests. Save that for end-to-end testing. But with unit tests, they have to be fast, okay? And they have to just literally be isolated from interacting with, other pieces of the application. So what we have to do is we actually need to mock this user.findOne call because we don't want to actually hit the database. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna take this user model and we're actually gonna mock out the findOne method call. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna actually just do jest.mock, and I'm gonna pass in the string of the import right over here, and this allows us to mock this whole module. Okay, and I'm going to go inside my test, and now what I can do is that I can actually mock certain methods, certain method calls from the user model. So recall that the user model has methods such as find one, find by ID. I'm going to go ahead and mock find one to return whatever I want. Okay, so we'll do something like let's see, user dot mock implementation once, and then we can just return, a fake user. Okay, now if you're using TypeScript, you're going to get some type errors if you do this, but because we're using JavaScript, this would work just fine. Okay, but now that we have mocked the implementation, actually, I'm sorry, it's not mock implementation one, sorry. It's actually, sorry about this, it's not user.mock implementation once. It should be user.findOne.mock implementation once. Okay, now watch this. I'm going to go ahead and run the test again. And let's see what happens. Okay, notice how the test actually doesn't buffer, it doesn't lag, it doesn't like wait anymore. It runs and fails instantly. And the reason why is because we returned a mock. Okay, we mocked the find one method, so instead of actually calling the actual database, we literally are mocking the entire thing. Okay, and so what now, if we look at the error logs over here, you can see that we have a different error. And what is this error? Well, it says cannot read properties of undefined reading status. So what's the problem here? Well, it's similar to the original problem that we had when it was trying to read the request.body property, because we're not passing in the response object. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a fake response object. So what does our response object need, at least in this function? Well, the response object needs a status, which is a function. It also needs .send, which is a function, and yeah, that's pretty much it. So, and this could be a little bit tricky because right now we're not calling response.send over here. We're actually calling response.status.send. Okay, so we're actually going to need to. I'm actually going to do this just to keep things simple. I'm going to do response.status and then response.send, just like that. Okay, because if we were to just leave it like this, we would actually have to mock the return value of status to return another object that has a send mock function, which is quite tedious. So we'll just do response.send. We'll do response.status and then response.send. Okay. All right. So the response object, we're going to first mock out the status. So this is just going to be just.fn. Okay, and just.fn is basically a way that it's basically what you could do to mock a function. So what happens with just.fn is it returns a mock function, okay? And a mock function is just literally just what it is, a mock. It's not a real function, okay? It just acts as like a proxy for the actual implementation, okay? In our case, we want to mock out the status function because we're not actually setting a status, right? We only want to mock out this function and check to see if it's actually going to be called with 400. And we also want to mock out the send function as well. So we'll do the same thing by calling just.fn. Okay? And we can now pass in response. And let's run the test again. And here you see that it passes. But again, we have not written any assertions yet, so let's write our first assertion. So we're going to go ahead and assert that the response.status call is 400. So we're going to go ahead and write expect response.status, and then we're going to use to have been called with 400. Let's go ahead and save. And you can see that it passes. Now, if I were to pass in a value that we know that it should not be, that response.status should not be called with, and run the test, you're going to see that it's going to fail. You're going to see that it expected a 401, but we received a 400, which means that our test actually is working properly. Let's go ahead and assert that response.send was called. And I'm not really too concerned with what response.send is called with. I'm just going to make sure that it has been called to have been called times 1. Let's run the test. And to have been called times just basically asserts how many times the function was called. If I passed in 2 and if I ran the test, it's going to throw an error. It's going to fail the test because it was only called once. Okay. So congratulations, we have successfully written our very first unit test. Now, unit testing can be very complicated if you don't really understand, the basic core fundamentals of mocking, stubbing, and it just can be very confusing. So just take some time to understand what we did so far. Okay, we basically mocked the find one call, so that way we are not actually hitting the database. We're just returning our own fake value for the test. Okay, because remember, we don't care about interacting with the database. We'll save that for end-to-end testing. What we want to do is we just want to return a fake value and then test this if-else statement to make sure that it actually works and is sending back a proper response. Okay, so the only thing that we have tested so far is that this find one is being called and that response.status and response.send are also being called as well. Let's go ahead and write a second test to actually test this else block over here. And this is where we're going to have to test to see if the user was not found. Okay, so let's go ahead and write another test. Should create a new user. Well, I'm going to write should send a status code of 201 when new user is created. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and test this else block. Okay, so what does this else block do? Well, if the user is not found, we're going to hash the password. We're then going to go ahead and call user.create, and then we're going to go ahead and send back a response with the status code of 201. So there's a couple stuff that we're doing. So let's start off with this. Remember, we need to go ahead and mock user.findOne again, because this test is completely different than the previous test. In the previous test, we mocked find1 to return a fake user value. Okay, and we did that because we wanted to make sure that this if condition was actually going to return truthy, right? So if userdb is truthy, execute this code. But now we need to make it so that userdb, this value is undefined. So we need to mock find1, so that way when it runs through this logic, it's going to actually hit the else block rather than the if block. So we're going to mock this again, and all we're going to do is just have this return undefined, like that. Okay, so user.find1 mock implementation once undefined. You can also mock resolved value once, and just pass in a value for it. Okay, you can just do that as well, and that would work fine. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and verify that it's calling this hash password function. So let me go ahead. Oh wait, I forgot to do one more thing. I forgot to go ahead and call auth register controller. So let's go ahead and run the test. And you're going to see that's going to fail. And it's going to complain about hash password. Right? It says hash password is not defined. And the reason why is because we don't have it defined at all. Well, first let's import that. Forgot to do that. All right, now that we have imported hash password, let's go back to our test file. Now, here, again, we don't want to actually call hash password, okay? Because what's going to happen is you're going to see that if we actually call hash password, if we actually were to like let this function get called, it's going to actually call the bcrypt library, but we don't want to do that. That would break the fundamental rule of unit testing. Remember, we don't want to actually have hash password, use its own dependencies like call bcrypt and have it call bcrypt hash sync. We want to actually mock hash password instead. Because remember, this operation can take up a lot of time in slowing your tests. So you have to remember to always mock your dependencies. In our case, hash password is also known as a dependency because this is a function that is supposed to be called in this else block and it's supposed to return some value. Okay, so we want to mock it. We want to make sure we're mocking it. So let's do that. So let's go ahead and import hash password from utils helpers. And then we can mock it down here. Let me actually move this user.find one up here. And let me go ahead and mock. Let's do this. Hash password mock mock return value once. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're just gonna mock the value of hash password, or I'm sorry, the return value of hash password when we call it, and you're gonna see that instead of logging actual hash, it's gonna log. Let's see. Did I do this wrong? Mock. I think it's mock return. Wait. Give me one sec. I'm actually going to go ahead and do this. I'm going to go ahead and remove this. And I'm going to do instead just.mock. Pass this in. And we're going to pass in a factory. And then we're going to pass in a property called hash password. And this should just be just.fn. So now let's go ahead and run the test again. Okay, there we go. So you can see that hash password now is going to return whatever we actually pass in for the function. Because remember, just.fn, this callback function here is going to be the actual function that is going to be the mock. So we just pass in x and return x. So we pass in the fake password, and we return the fake password. So we can actually just have this hard-coded to be whatever we want. So hash password. And if I save and if I run the test again, you're going to see in the console log. What's going on here? Oh, whoops, sorry. It's just.fn. There we go. Sorry about that. There we go. So you can see that this console log comes from auth.js right over here. But you can see that it's logging the fake hash password. Okay, so what I just did up top here is I actually just provided a factory, and you can do this to mock named exports that are all in a module. So inside this helpers module, we actually have a bunch of named exports like this hash password and compare password, and I can just mock the values of those named exports. So I can mock hash password to be a mock function, and this mock function, we can do that by using just.fn. Okay, so now that hash password is mocked, let's go ahead and continue. So let's go ahead and mock user.create. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing that we did up here with user.find1. We're going to go ahead and mock user.create. So that way it doesn't actually call the database. Okay, so what we could do is we could just do something like user.create mock resolved value once. Or we can also mock the implementation as well. But I'll just mock the resolved value, and we'll just go ahead and just pass in the fake user. Okay, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and write some assertions. So let me actually do this. Let me import hash password again. Okay, and let me go ahead and write some assertions. So I want to expect hash password to have been called with, and then we're gonna expect it to have been called with fake password. Okay, so let's run the test and let's make sure that this passes. Perfect, it is called with fake password. Now I know that the return value is hash password, okay, but the actual value that's being passed into the function is whatever value is coming from the request.body.password property. Okay, so it is being called with the correct fake password. Let's write another assertion. Expect user.create to have been called with, and what is it being called with? Password and email. So the password here is the hashed password. So we're going to pass in the actual mock value, and the email will just pass in the email that comes from the request body. So we'll pass in for email, fake email, and then for password, we'll pass in hash password up here. And let's go ahead and run the test and let's see what happens. There you go, you can see that it passes. So that is pretty much it with that. Let's go ahead and write one last assertion. Expect res.send, or I think it's response.send, to have been called with 201. And that's just asserting that this response.send is being called with 201. Okay, and let's go ahead and run the test again. Let's make sure that it works. And there you go. And of course, you can pass in invalid values and make sure that it should fail. As you can see over here, if I were to pass in a different value for response.send, you would see that it also fails as well. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty much it when it comes to testing your Express app. Now, it's obviously going to be different sometimes when you have different dependencies, right? But this is pretty much just a general gist of how you can mock dependencies, how you can actually mock database calls, how you can write assertions, how you can stub out data. Like, for example, we stubbed out the request and response objects, and we passed in fake data. Okay? So, yeah, I know this was a very long video, but there's a lot of stuff that we had to cover. So, hopefully you all learned a lot of stuff. And that's going to be pretty much it for this video. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next episode. Peace out.